What if Hollywood's brightest stars weren't lost to time, but erased? Imagine crafting a legacy on the silver screen, only to have it ripped away overnight, not for scandal, not for lack of talent, but for daring to have an opinion, a principled stand, or loving the wrong person. This is the untold story of Golden Age actresses blacklisted by Hollywood, women whose careers were murdered by the McCarthy era's ruthless political witch hunts. From Oscar winners to rising stars, they were silenced for refusing to betray their ideals, their friends, or their families. Their crime? Courage. Discover how fear and paranoia stole decades of artistry. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Dorothy Parker. Dorothy Parker wasn't just a writer with a razor-sharp wit. She was also an actress whose political convictions cost her dearly. In the 1930s, Parker became increasingly vocal about her left-leaning views, supporting anti-fascist causes when many in Hollywood remained silent. Her outspoken nature and refusal to compromise her beliefs made her an easy target during the Red Scare. When the HUAC investigations intensified, Parker found herself named as a communist sympathizer. Studio executives, terrified of being associated with anyone even remotely suspicious, quickly distanced themselves. Her screenwriting opportunities dried up, and her brief acting career was completely derailed. Parker's journey to the blacklist began long before HUAC. Her involvement with the Screenwriters Guild and her founding role in the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League in 1936 marked her as politically active. Her satirical pieces for The New Yorker and other publications often carried political undertones that didn't go unnoticed. By the time HUAC turned its gaze on Hollywood, Parker was already in their crosshairs. What's particularly tragic about Parker's case is that her blacklisting cut short what might have been a fascinating late-career transition to acting. Though primarily known for her writing, Parker had begun taking small film roles that showcased her unique personality and wit. One colleague remarked, "Dorothy on screen was Dorothy in life, brilliant, cutting, and utterly authentic." This authenticity, coupled with her writing skills, could have made her one of Hollywood's most interesting character actresses had political persecution not intervened. Though she continued writing for publications, Parker's Hollywood dreams were permanently shattered by a system that valued conformity over talent. Years later, she would remark with characteristic wit, "Hollywood demanded I sell my soul, and I told them I'd already given it to the highest bidder, my own conscience." Gail Sergard, once celebrated for her Academy Award-winning performance in Anthony Adverse, Gail Sergard's star was on a meteoric rise until politics intervened. When her husband, director Herbert Biberman, became one of the Hollywood 10, refusing to testify before HUAC, Sergard stood by him. This loyalty to her husband proved catastrophic for her career. Studio heads, paranoid about communist infiltration, saw her as guilty by association. Overnight, the woman who had captivated audiences with her magnetic screen presence became persona non grata in Hollywood. Sergard's pre-blacklist career had been truly exceptional. After her Oscar win for Best Supporting Actress in her very first film role, she delivered memorable performances in films like The Life of Emile Zola and The Letter. She was even originally cast as the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz, before the character concept changed from glamorous to grotesque. Critics consistently praised her ability to bring complexity to roles that might have been one-dimensional in lesser hands. In 1947, both Sergard and Biberman were called to testify before HUAC. In a display of tremendous courage, Sergard declined to appear, knowing it would mean professional suicide. She later explained, "I am an American, and I will not be intimidated, and neither will my husband." True to her prediction, after their stand against HUAC, the couple found themselves completely blacklisted. The timing couldn't have been worse professionally. At 47, Sergard was entering what should have been her prime years for character roles, when her talent and experience would have allowed her to take on increasingly complex parts. Instead, she disappeared from screens for over 2 decades. When she did return in the 1965 film Slaves, she found an industry that had moved on without her, though critics noted that her talent remained undiminished despite the 20-year absence. For supporting her husband and refusing to denounce him, Sergard paid with her career, a devastating price for simply standing by her family in the face of political persecution. Joan Crawford. Though Joan Crawford is remembered today for her legendary roles, what many don't know is how close she came to complete professional destruction. Behind her glamorous exterior lay rumors of political affiliations that nearly ended her career. Whispers of Crawford's alleged sympathies with left-leaning causes started circulating during the height of the Red Scare. Studio executives, already walking on eggshells, became increasingly wary of her. As accusations mounted about her attendance at supposedly subversive gatherings, Crawford found herself fighting not just for roles, but for her entire career. Crawford's situation differed from many others on this list, in that she managed to navigate the blacklist era without being completely ostracized. This was partly due to her already established star power and her willingness to distance herself publicly from any controversial associations. However, this survival came at a significant cost. Crawford found herself taking roles in smaller productions and accepting less favorable terms just to keep working. What's less known about Crawford's brush with the blacklist is how it affected her personally. Friends reported that she lived in constant anxiety during this period, afraid that each phone call might bring news that she had been named in testimony or added to the blacklist. This fear led her to become increasingly isolated, turning down social invitations and avoiding political discussions of any kind. The experience also shaped her later career choices. After narrowly escaping full blacklisting, Crawford became known for her intense work ethic and willingness to take on roles that other stars of her caliber might have rejected. As she later confided to a close friend, "When you've almost lost everything once, you never take work for granted again." This perspective fueled her later career resurgence, including her Oscar-nominated performance in Sudden Fear and her iconic role in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Though she ultimately survived the blacklist era more successfully than others, the shadow of suspicion followed her for years, forcing her to take smaller roles in less prominent projects than her talent deserved. Betty Garrett. When Betty Garrett married actor Larry Parks, she couldn't have known how drastically their lives would change. Parks, who had reluctantly named names before HUAC, found himself blacklisted anyway. And Garrett, guilty only of being his wife, was swept up in the same wave of persecution. Despite her undeniable talent as both an actress and a singer, Garrett saw her promising career at MGM abruptly terminated. Roles that would have showcased her vibrant personality and comedic timing disappeared overnight. Studios that had once competed for her services now wouldn't even return her agent's calls. Garrett's pre-blacklist career had been brimming with promise. Her performances in On the Town and Take Me Out to the Ballgame alongside Frank Sinatra and Gene Kelly had established her as a triple threat performer with a gift for musical comedy. MGM had been grooming her for starring roles when the blacklist derailed everything. The cruel irony of Garrett's situation was that Parks had actually cooperated with HUAC, admitting to brief Communist Party membership in his youth and providing names, a decision that tormented him morally, but which he made hoping to protect his family and career. Despite this cooperation, both he and Garrett found themselves blacklisted, demonstrating the capricious nature of the persecution. The couple's financial situation quickly became dire. With both their film careers destroyed overnight, they sold their home and turned to theater and nightclub performances to survive. Garrett later recalled, "We went from being Hollywood royalty to wondering how we'd pay next month's rent in the space of a few weeks." Garrett's resilience during this period was remarkable. Rather than becoming bitter, she focused on reinventing herself, developing a nightclub act with Parks, and eventually finding work in theater. It would be nearly 20 years before television roles began to come her way again, including recurring parts in All in the Family and Laverne and Shirley that introduced her talent to a new generation. For years, Garrett was forced to survive on stage work and small television appearances. Her film career effectively ended by an industry too afraid to stand up for its own. When asked later if she regretted standing by her husband, Garrett replied with characteristic fortitude, "Never. Some things are more important than a career, and integrity is one of them." Anne Ravier. Few falls from grace were as dramatic as Anne Ravier's. After winning an Academy Award for National Velvet and earning 2 other nominations, Ravier was at the peak of her career when the blacklist struck. When summoned before HUAC, she refused to testify, invoking her Fifth Amendment rights. The consequences were swift and brutal. The woman who had just been celebrated for her extraordinary talent found herself unable to secure any film work. Her name was removed from credits, her performances forgotten, What made Ravier's blacklisting particularly shocking to the industry was her stature. This wasn't an up-and-coming actress or a minor player. This was an Academy Award winner at the height of her powers. Prior to her blacklisting, Ravier had specialized in playing strong, principled maternal figures in films such as National Velvet, Gentleman's Agreement, and The Song of Bernadette. The irony wasn't lost on her colleagues that Ravier displayed in real life the same principles and courage she had portrayed on screen. When called before HUAC in 1951, Ravier's response was characteristically dignified. She simply stated, "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions," before invoking her Fifth Amendment rights. This principled stand came with the full understanding that it would likely end her film career. The Hollywood community's failure to stand by Ravier highlighted the industry's moral cowardice during this period. Despite her Oscar and critical acclaim, Ravier was forced to return to stage work, her film career in tatters. It would be 20 years before she would appear in another film, 2 decades of prime acting years stolen by political persecution. When she finally returned to the screen in Tell Me That You Love Me, Junie Moon in 1970, critics noted that her talent remains undiminished, making the 2-decade absence all the more tragic. A colleague who worked with her on this comeback film remarked, "Watching Anne work was like witnessing a master class. You couldn't help but wonder how many great performances we all missed during those lost years." Rose Hobart. When Rose Hobart stood before HUAC and refused to name names, she knew she was likely sacrificing her career, but she couldn't have imagined the totality of her professional destruction. Once a rising star with appearances in over 40 films, Hobart's principled stance led to immediate blacklisting. Virtually overnight, Hobart went from promising actress to industry outcast. Her name was removed from consideration for new projects, and studios edited her out of films already in production. Forced to sell her home and find work outside the industry, Hobart later remarked, "One day I was an actress with a promising future. The next day, I was a shadow person no one would even look at." Hobart's path to the blacklist began with her active involvement in the Screen Actors Guild, where she advocated for better working conditions for performers. This labor activism, combined with her attendance at meetings to discuss progressive causes, placed her on HUAC's radar. When called to testify in 1950, she refused to implicate others, a stance that guaranteed her professional exile. The suddenness of Hobart's career collapse was stunning even by blacklist standards. Projects she had been verbally promised vanished. Friends in the industry stopped returning her calls, afraid that association with her might taint them as well. Within months, she was forced to sell her home and move to a small apartment, taking jobs as a sales clerk and later as a building manager to survive. What distinguished Hobart's response to her blacklisting was her eventual activism on behalf of other victims. In the 1960s, as the worst of the McCarthy era faded, Hobart began speaking publicly about her experiences, ensuring that newer generations would understand the human cost of political persecution. She became an important voice in documenting this dark chapter of Hollywood history, telling a journalist in 1965, "They took our livelihoods, but they couldn't take our dignity or our truth." Her story remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of talent sacrificed on the altar of political paranoia. Meline Lee. Meline Lee's career was just beginning to flourish when the blacklist destroyed everything she had worked for. Known for her vibrant character roles and distinctive voice, Lee found herself under suspicion not for anything she had done, but because of her marriage to actor Jack Gilford, who had been named in red channels. Without warning or explanation, casting directors stopped calling. Projects she had been promised mysteriously went to other actresses. Studio executives who had praised her talent suddenly claimed not to know who she was. Lee's case illustrates the particularly vulnerable position of women in the industry during the blacklist era. While her husband was targeted primarily for his own political activities, Lee found herself professionally ostracized, largely for being loyal to him. The unspoken expectation seemed to be that she should either divorce Gilford or publicly denounce him, options that her principles wouldn't allow her to consider. The couple's financial situation deteriorated rapidly as both found themselves unemployable in Hollywood. With a growing family to support, they turned to theater work on the East Coast, where the blacklist's grip, while still present, wasn't quite as absolute as in Hollywood. Even there, they frequently faced canceled contracts when producers discovered their blacklisted status. What makes Lee's story particularly poignant is how her career was cut short just as it was gaining momentum. Critics had begun to take notice of her distinctive performances, with one reviewer highlighting her rare ability to bring humanity and depth to even the smallest roles. This emerging talent was completely derailed by the blacklist, with many of her most promising years lost to political persecution. Throughout this ordeal, Lee and Guilford maintained both their marriage and their principles, a personal victory in the face of professional devastation. When asked years later if she regretted standing by her husband, Lee replied simply, "How could I regret doing the right thing?" The blacklist took my career, but it couldn't take my self-respect. For supporting her husband and refusing to participate in the naming of names, Lee's promising career was effectively ended before it had truly begun. A bright light extinguished by the shadow of political fear. Jean Muir. Few blacklisting cases shocked Hollywood as much as Jean Muir's. As the star of the new television series, The Aldrich Family, Muir seemed set for a successful transition from film to the new medium. But just days before the show was to air, her name appeared in Red Channels, a publication listing supposed communist sympathizers. Without investigation or opportunity for defense, General Foods immediately pulled their sponsorship. NBC canceled the show rather than replace the sponsor. Overnight, Muir went from television star to industry pariah. Muir's case is particularly significant as it represented one of the first major television blacklistings, signaling that the new medium would follow Hollywood's lead in political persecution. What made her situation especially troubling was the flimsy nature of the evidence against her. Red Channels cited her membership in organizations that, while progressive, were perfectly legal and included many prominent Americans among their supporters. The suddenness and completeness of Muir's professional destruction was staggering. On a Friday, she was preparing for the premiere of her new series. By Monday, she was unemployable. The network and sponsor made no attempt to verify the accusations against her or to provide her with an opportunity to address them. This case established the template that would be followed in countless subsequent blacklistings. Accusation equaled guilt, and no defense was possible. Muir's response was both dignified and determined. Unlike some who retreated from public view, she fought back publicly, giving interviews and pursuing legal action against Red Channels. Though these efforts ultimately did little to salvage her career, they helped expose the arbitrary and unjust nature of the blacklist to the American public. Despite legal action and eventual vindication, the damage was done. Muir's promising career was destroyed, making her one of the first and most high-profile victims of television blacklisting, a chilling warning to others about the new reach of political persecution. Mady Christians. Mady Christians' story demonstrates how even established stars weren't safe from the blacklist's reach. A successful actress in both Europe and America, Christians had built a reputation for powerful, nuanced performances. But when her name appeared in Red Channels, everything changed. Roles dried up immediately. Studios that had courted her now wouldn't acknowledge her existence. The stress of sudden unemployment and constant surveillance took a physical toll. Christian suffered a stroke at the height of the blacklist period and died shortly thereafter at just 56 years old. The cruel irony of Christian's blacklisting was that she was persecuted in America for allegedly holding views similar to those that had caused her to flee Europe. Friends reported that this paradox particularly distressed her, having escaped one form of ideological persecution only to encounter another in her adopted country. When Red Channels listed her name, Christians found herself instantly unemployable despite her considerable talent and following. The Broadway producers who had previously competed for her services suddenly claimed scheduling conflicts. Film offers disappeared. Even radio roles where she had been a regular presence vanished overnight. Many of her colleagues believed the strain of being blacklisted directly contributed to her premature death, making her perhaps the most literal casualty of Hollywood's darkest hour. Her friend and fellow actress Mady Christians later observed, "Mady survived the Nazis only to be killed by American fear. There's a lesson in that tragedy that we still haven't fully learned." Marsha Hunt. Marsha Hunt's path from MGM starlet to blacklist victim illustrates how quickly fortunes could change. With over 50 films to her credit by the late 1940s, Hunt seemed destined for long-term stardom. But her support for a group called the Committee for the First Amendment, which opposed HUAC's tactics, landed her on the blacklist. The effect was immediate. Hunt went from receiving weekly film offers to complete professional silence. A new contract with Paramount was suddenly withdrawn without explanation. Directors who had praised her talent now claimed their hands were tied. What makes Hunt's case particularly noteworthy is how relatively mild her political activity had been. She hadn't been a member of the Communist Party or even particularly outspoken about progressive causes beyond basic civil liberties. Her primary offense was joining fellow Hollywood figures in questioning HUAC's methods and defending the right to free speech and association, principles enshrined in the Constitution. The Committee for the First Amendment, which triggered her blacklisting, had been formed specifically to protest HUAC's Hollywood hearings. Hunt and others flew to Washington to observe the proceedings firsthand, believing that their presence might help ensure fairness. Instead, they found themselves added to the growing list of subversives for simply witnessing the hearings critically. Hunt's response to her blacklisting was characterized by dignity and resilience. Rather than becoming bitter, she redirected her creative energies toward humanitarian causes, becoming an early advocate for the United Nations and global refugee issues. When limited acting opportunities did come her way, primarily in television, she approached them with the same professionalism and commitment that had characterized her film work. Though Hunt eventually found limited work in television, her film career never recovered from the blacklist's impact. Years later, she reflected, "I was punished for having an American concern for justice." Her story represents countless careers sacrificed not for any actual wrongdoing, but for the simple courage to stand up for constitutional principles. Betsy Blair. Even marriage to one of Hollywood's biggest stars couldn't protect Betsy Blair from the blacklist's reach. As the wife of Gene Kelly, Blair might have expected some immunity from persecution, but her political activities made her a target, regardless of her famous husband. Blair's outspoken support for progressive causes and her refusal to distance herself from blacklisted friends led to her own name being added to the industry's unofficial untouchables list. Despite Kelly's star power and attempts to protect her, Blair found herself unable to secure roles. Blair's situation highlights the complex social dynamics of Hollywood during the blacklist era. While Kelly's clout offered some protection, it also created tension in their marriage as he was pressured by studio executives to rein in his wife's political activities. Friends reported that Blair refused to compromise her principles, even when it became clear that doing so might salvage her career. What made Blair's blacklisting particularly frustrating was that it came just as her acting talents were being recognized. Her performance in Marty would eventually earn her an Academy Award nomination, but the path to securing that role required extraordinary measures. It took Kelly's direct intervention and ultimatum to MGM, threatening to leave the studio himself, to secure Blair her role in. Despite the critical acclaim for her Marty performance, Blair found that the blacklist still limited her options in Hollywood. In 1957, she made the difficult decision to move to Europe, joining the exodus of American creative talent fleeing McCarthy-era persecution. There, she found the artistic freedom that had been denied her in America, working with directors like Michelangelo Antonioni and building a respected international career. Blair's story had a more positive resolution than many others on this list, but the damage was done, and Blair, like many others, eventually left America for Europe, where artists weren't punished for their political beliefs. Years later, she would reflect, "In a strange way, the blacklist freed me by forcing me to build a career outside the Hollywood system. But I'll never forget the colleagues who didn't have the options I did." Tippi Hedin. While Tippi Hedren's blacklisting wasn't politically motivated like most others on this list, her story reveals another dark truth about Hollywood: the power male directors held over actresses' careers. After starring in Hitchcock's The Birds and Marnie, Hedin seemed destined for a brilliant career. But when she refused Hitchcock's romantic advances, the punishment was swift. Hitchcock used his considerable influence to prevent other directors from hiring her. He kept her under contract but wouldn't cast her, effectively paying her to do nothing while preventing her from working elsewhere. Hedren's situation demonstrates how women in Hollywood faced unique forms of career sabotage beyond political blacklisting. Hitchcock's obsession with Hedin has been well documented. including his inappropriate behavior on set and his attempts to control her personal life. When she firmly rejected his advances, he responded by essentially holding her career hostage. Though technically not part of the McCarthy-era blacklist, Hedren's experience shows how the power imbalances in Hollywood created conditions where careers could be destroyed through personal vendettas. Hitchcock's actions, keeping her under contract while refusing to cast her and discouraging other directors from hiring her, created a professional isolation nearly identical to political blacklisting in its effects. What distinguishes Hedren's response was her determination to eventually break free from Hitchcock's control, even knowing it might permanently damage her acting prospects. When she finally escaped her contract, she found that his influence had indeed limited her opportunities in major productions. Nevertheless, she continued working in smaller films and eventually channeled her energies into animal rights activism, founding the Shambhala Preserve for exotic animals. This professional isolation, a different kind of blacklisting, demonstrates how women in Hollywood faced unique vulnerabilities. Hedren's promising career was derailed not because of her political beliefs, but because she dared to say no to a powerful man who thought he owned her. Jean Ruol. Jean Ruol's path from actress to blacklisted exile shows how thoroughly lives could be uprooted by political persecution. After establishing herself as both an actress and a screenwriter, Ruol and her husband, screenwriter Hugo Butler, were subpoenaed by HUAC in 1951. Rather than face the committee, the couple made the heartbreaking decision to flee to Mexico with their 4 children. For 13 years, they lived in exile, writing under pseudonyms to support their family. Ruol was forced to abandon her acting career entirely. Ruol's journey into exile reveals the impossible choices faced by those targeted by HUAC. The couple knew that appearing before the committee meant either naming friends, something their principles wouldn't allow, or facing contempt charges and likely imprisonment. With 4 young children to consider, they chose the dramatic step of leaving their country rather than compromising their integrity or risking separation from their family. Life in Mexico brought significant hardships. Cut off from their professional networks and struggling with language barriers, the couple survived by writing scripts that were smuggled back to sympathetic producers in Hollywood who arranged payment through intermediaries. Their children grew up as expatriates, always aware that their parents' political beliefs had forced this nomadic existence. What makes Ruol's story especially poignant is how completely she had to reinvent herself professionally. Having begun her career as an actress, appearing in films like Stage Door and All Over Town, she found that screenwriting was the only aspect of her Hollywood career that could continue in exile, albeit under pseudonyms. This forced transition ultimately led to a successful writing career, but the choice was born of necessity rather than preference. When they finally returned to the United States in 1964, the Hollywood they had known no longer existed for them. Despite her talent, Ruol never returned to the screen, her acting career one of the many casualties of an era when fear trumped art and freedom. In later years, she would document this experience in her memoir, Refugees from Hollywood, providing a valuable historical record of the personal cost of political persecution. Karen Morley. Karen Morley's promising career at MGM was flourishing with standout performances in films like Dinner at 8 and Scarface, when her political activities drew unwanted attention. Morley had become increasingly involved in labor organizing and progressive causes, activities that placed her firmly on HUAC's radar. When called before the committee in 1952, Morley took a principled stand, refusing to answer questions about her political affiliations or to implicate others. The industry response was immediate and devastating. Already struggling with fewer roles due to unofficial blacklisting, Morley now found herself completely unemployable in Hollywood. What made Morley's blacklisting particularly tragic was that she had already been fighting an uphill battle as an actress, approaching 40 in an industry obsessed with youth. The blacklist eliminated any chance she might have had to transition to the character roles that could have sustained the second phase of her career. A director who had worked with her commented, "Karen had the talent and intelligence to become one of our great character actresses if she'd been given the chance." Morley's post-blacklist years were marked by financial struggle and professional disappointment. Attempts to find work in New York theater met with limited success, as the blacklist's reach extended beyond Hollywood. She eventually withdrew from acting entirely, turning to real estate to support herself. In a rare 1973 interview, Morley reflected on the cost of her stance. "Of course, I lost my career, but I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd taken the other path. There are more important things than Hollywood success, and personal integrity is at the top of that list." Lena Horn. While Lena Horn is remembered today primarily for breaking racial barriers in Hollywood, less discussed is how the blacklist compounded the discrimination she already faced as an African-American performer. Horn's progressive politics, including her friendship with Paul Robeson and her civil rights activism, made her a target during the McCarthy era. Though never formally called before HUAC, Horn found herself listed in red channels and subsequently saw her already limited Hollywood opportunities disappear completely. Studio executives who had been reluctant to cast her in substantive roles now had the perfect excuse to avoid working with her altogether. Horn's experience demonstrates how the blacklist often intersected with existing forms of discrimination. As a black performer, she had already faced significant barriers in a segregated industry. The blacklist provided studios with a convenient justification for continuing patterns of exclusion under the guise of political caution. Faced with diminishing film prospects, Horn redirected her energies toward her nightclub and recording career, where the blacklist's impact, while still present, wasn't as absolute. Her resilience during this period was remarkable. Rather than allowing the combined forces of racism and political persecution to silence her, she found alternative venues for her artistic expression and continued her civil rights activism. When the worst of the blacklist era had passed, Horn made a triumphant return to film in the 1969 Western Death of a Gunfighter, followed by memorable appearances in The Wiz and other productions. However, the blacklist had cost her many of her prime acting years and limited what might have been an even more groundbreaking film career, Kim Hunter. Kim Hunter's Oscar win for her role as Stella in A Streetcar Named Desire should have been the beginning of a stellar career. Instead, it marked the high point before the blacklist derailed her professional trajectory. Hunter's social activism and involvement with organizations later labeled as subversive placed her name in red channels, effectively ending her film career just as it was reaching its peak. The timing couldn't have been worse professionally. The acclaim for her Streetcar performance had positioned her for leading roles in major productions. Instead, she found herself unemployable in Hollywood virtually overnight. One day, she was an Oscar-winning actress with a bright future. The next, she couldn't get past studio gates for meetings. Hunter's response to her blacklisting showed remarkable adaptability. Unable to find film work, she turned to the emerging medium of television, working in live drama productions where the blacklist was sometimes less rigidly enforced. She also returned to her theatrical roots, appearing in Broadway productions throughout the 1950s. What made Hunter's case particularly frustrating was the arbitrary nature of her blacklisting. She was never a member of the Communist Party, and her political activities consisted mainly of supporting civil liberties and opposing fascism, positions that had been mainstream during World War II but became suddenly suspect as the Cold War intensified. When Hunter finally returned to film in the late 1950s, she found herself largely relegated to supporting roles, her momentum and star potential diminished by the years away from the big screen. As she later observed, winning an Oscar is supposed to be a beginning, not an end. But for those of us caught in the blacklist, that golden statue became a bookmark for dreams interrupted. Ruth Gordon. While Ruth Gordon is best remembered for her late career renaissance in films like Rosemary's Baby and Harold and Maude, few realize that the blacklist created a nearly two-decade gap in her film career. Gordon's association with progressive causes and her marriage to screenwriter Garson Kanin, who was also under scrutiny, placed her under suspicion during the Red Scare. Though Gordon was never formally called before HUAC, industry insiders understood she was considered politically questionable. Film offers that should have come her way, particularly after her critically acclaimed performance in Adam's Rib, mysteriously disappeared. From 1950 to the mid-1960s, Gordon appeared in only one film, despite being at a perfect age for character roles. What saved Gordon from complete professional destruction was her versatility. Unable to find film work, she redirected her energies to writing plays with her husband and occasional theater performances. This creative flexibility allowed her to maintain an artistic presence even when Hollywood doors were closed to her. The great irony of Gordon's story is that when she finally returned to films in her 70s, she was treated as a delightful discovery by a new generation of filmmakers and audiences. Few realized they were watching an actress who had been deliberately sidelined for nearly 2 decades at what should have been the height of her character acting years. Her Oscar win for Rosemary's Baby at age 72 represented not just a late career triumph, but a vindication after years of politically motivated exclusion. Gordon's experience demonstrates how the blacklist not only harmed individual careers, but robbed audiences of what might have been. As one film historian noted, when we look at Ruth Gordon's brilliant performances from the late 1960s and 1970s, we can't help but wonder what masterpieces we missed during her blacklist years. Judy Holiday. Judy Holiday's encounter with the blacklist demonstrates how even an Academy Award couldn't provide complete protection from political persecution. After winning the Best Actress Oscar for Born Yesterday in 1950, Holiday should have had her pick of roles. Instead, she found herself fighting for her career when she was named in Red Channels and called to testify before HUAC. Unlike many others on this list, Holiday managed to navigate the blacklist without being completely ostracized, largely thanks to the protection of studio head Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures. However, this survival came at a significant cost. The stress of the HUAC investigation and the constant scrutiny of her political associations took a tremendous psychological toll. Holiday's approach to her HUAC testimony became legendary in Hollywood circles. Drawing on her Born Yesterday character's ditzy blonde persona, she reportedly played up her confusion and naivety during questioning frustrating committee members while avoiding both naming names and contempt charges. This strategy, while effective in the short term, reinforced stereotypes about her that she had fought hard to overcome. The blacklist era significantly limited what might have been an even more extraordinary career. Film offers became scarcer, and Holiday increasingly returned to Broadway, where the blacklist's impact was sometimes less severe. The stress of constant political scrutiny contributed to health problems that ultimately led to her premature death from breast cancer at just 43. Shortly before her death, Holiday confided to a friend, "The worst part wasn't the career limitations. It was the constant fear and the feeling that at any moment, everything you'd worked for could be taken away on someone's whim." Her story illustrates how even those who survived the blacklist professionally often paid a devastating personal price. Lee Grant. Few blacklisted actresses managed to rebuild their careers as successfully as Lee Grant, but her comeback didn't diminish the 12 years stolen from her at the height of her powers. Grant's troubles began when she delivered a eulogy at the funeral of actor J. Edward Bromberg, who had died of a heart attack after being aggressively questioned by HUAC. Her simple act of compassion for a colleague landed her name in Red Channels. When called before HUAC, Grant refused to testify against her first husband, playwright Arnold Manoff. The response was swift. Her thriving career, which had included an Oscar nomination for her film debut in Detective Story, came to an abrupt halt. From 1952 to 1964, Grant was completely blacklisted from film and television. What distinguished Grant's blacklist experience was her productive use of the enforced hiatus. Unable to work in film, she devoted herself to studying her craft, taking acting classes and working in regional theater whenever possible. This period of intensive study ultimately made her an even more formidable performer when she finally returned to the screen. When the blacklist finally eased, Grant returned with extraordinary vigor, winning an Emmy for her role in Peyton Place, and eventually an Oscar for Shampoo. She later expanded into directing, winning an Academy Award for her documentary Down and Out in America. As she accepted her Oscar, many in the audience understood it represented not just recognition for a single film, but vindication after years of unjust persecution. Grant's resilience was remarkable, but she never minimized the damage done by the blacklist. "They stole 12 years of my career," she later stated. "No award or subsequent success can ever give those years back." Her story represents both the terrible waste of the blacklist era and the extraordinary courage of those who refused to be permanently defeated by it. Lillian Helman. Though primarily known as a playwright rather than an actress, Lillian Helman's blacklisting profoundly impacted both her theatrical career and her occasional screen appearances. Her refusal to name names before HUAC became one of the most famous acts of resistance during the McCarthy era, encapsulated in her famous declaration, "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions." Helman's career had been flourishing before the blacklist, with successful plays like The Little Foxes and Watch on the Rhine adapted into acclaimed films. She occasionally appeared as herself in films and television, bringing her sharp wit and intellectual presence to the screen. The blacklist ended these opportunities completely and severely limited production of her plays. What distinguished Helman's response to her blacklisting was her unflinching documentation of the experience. Her memoir, Scoundrel Time, provided one of the most articulate and damning accounts of the blacklist era, ensuring that future generations would understand the period's moral failures. While some who had collaborated with HUAC attempted to minimize or justify their actions in later years, Helman never wavered in her condemnation of those who sacrificed their colleagues to save themselves. The financial impact of the blacklist on Helman was severe. Production of her plays dwindled, and film adaptations became impossible. She supported herself by teaching, writing criticism, and translating other playwrights' work. Yet despite these hardships, she continued writing, producing some of her finest work during this period of professional exile. When the blacklist finally eased in the 1960s, Helman experienced a career renaissance, with renewed interest in her plays and her memoirs becoming bestsellers. Her courageous stand during the McCarthy era became as much a part of her legacy as her literary achievements, making her an important symbol of artistic integrity in the face of political intimidation. Margaret Webster. As one of the first women to achieve prominence as a theatrical director, Margaret Webster had already broken significant gender barriers before the blacklist derailed her career. Her innovative Shakespeare productions and her commitment to creating opportunities for actors of color had established her as one of the most forward-thinking creative forces in American theater. Webster's political troubles began with her involvement in progressive causes, including anti-fascist organizations during World War II. When the political climate shifted during the Cold War, these same activities became grounds for suspicion. After being named in red channels, Webster found herself unable to secure work in television and film, and even her theatrical opportunities dwindled significantly. The loss to American culture was substantial. Webster had been pioneering colorblind casting and bringing classical theater to new audiences, approaches that would become standard practice decades later. Her blacklisting effectively silenced one of the most innovative voices in American theater at the height of her creative powers. Webster's response to her blacklisting reflected both resilience and pragmatism. She returned to her native England for much of the 1950s, working in theater there while waiting for the political climate in America to improve. This self-imposed exile allowed her to continue her artistic development, but separated her from the American theatrical scene she had helped shape. When Webster finally returned to the United States in the early 1960s, she found a theatrical landscape that had moved on without her. Though she continued directing occasionally, she never regained the influential position she had held before the blacklist. As she reflected in her memoir, the blacklist didn't just interrupt careers, it permanently altered their trajectories. Even when you could work again, you returned to a different world than the one you'd been forced to leave. If you remember the name of any such actress whose career was unjustly shattered by the blacklist, mention their name below. If this look into Hollywood's shameful past resonated with you, please hit that like button and share this video to help these forgotten stories reach a wider audience. Subscribe for more deep dives into film history's untold chapters and hidden figures. Remember, in the words of Dorothy Parker, they can blacklist my name, but they can't blacklist the truth. Until next time, keep questioning the narratives we're sold about Hollywood's golden age. There's always more beneath the glitter and gold.